Well, a little bit of delay. Today, I'm going to go over some of the new spoilers coming out for Murders at Karlov Manor. So let's get into it and talk about those cards. But first, we're going to talk about a few of the new mechanics so you can kind of understand where some of these cards are going for, because not all of them include reminder text at what the new abilities do. And a good example of this is actually one of the new legends that are coming in the set, Ogre's Cause, Spirit of Justice, 4 mana, 2/4, Spirit Detective. Detective is a new creature type in this set. Double strike vigilance. When it attacks or enters the battlefield, choose up to one target creature. If it is suspected, exile it. Otherwise, suspect it. So this is our first new mechanic, Suspect. So what a suspected creature does is it gains menace and cannot block. So of course, you can kind of use this in either a way to mess with your opponents trying to do things with the new Suspect mechanic, or you can actually use it as a way just to get something through when you're attacking and mess up their blocking schemes instead. So this is going to be something that's prevalent on a lot of cards. There's also things that say, if you don't have something that is suspected, you get to do something else. There's a bunch of different things that you can do with this mechanic in the new set. Then we're going to move into the next mechanic that's coming up, and that is Collect Evidence. Now, this is very much a murder mystery type set, so that's what a lot of this stuff is going to talk about. This is Analyze the Pollen for a green. You can search your library for a basic land card, and it says, if evidence was collected, instead search your library for a creature or a land card, and either way, put the cards into your hand. The Collect Evidence on this card is 8, so it's an additional cost to cast a spell. You can do 8, and Collect Evidence means to exile cards with total mana value 8 or more from your graveyard. So it's kind of a riff on the Delve mechanic, sort of, but Delve actually reduces the cost of spells per card you exile. In this way, it's remove the mana value from your graveyard, but then you get a bonus event attached to the card, sort of like a kicker type effect. Now, next is the Disguise mechanic, which is a riff on Morph. I'll get more into that in a minute, but what you do is you play the disguised creature down on its face for 3 mana, but unlike Morphs, this gains 2 ward on top of that. That's the disguise part. So what do you get with a disguised creature? Well, this is Aurelius Vindicator. For 4 mana, you get a 4/2 angel, flying, lifelink, and ward 2 out of its own ward. Pretty stock standard for an angel. But if you played it face down and then pay the disguise cost of X3 and a white, when it's turned up, you exile up to X other target creatures from the your graveyards or the battlefield. And then when the Vindicator leaves the battlefield, return the exiled cards to their owner's hands. So this has a couple of implications with this particular card. One, you can, clear the road, get rid of the blockers that are in your way by just flipping this over and then getting rid of the blockers, and then it's free swinging. Or say someone's going to board wipe your stuff. Well, anything that might have gotten discarded or destroyed earlier in the game or whatever is going on, you can pay into that X. So say you pay X is 3. So for 7 mana, you can exile 3 cards from your graveyard, and as soon as the board wipe resolves, those 3 cards are coming right back to your hand. So you have kind of a trick to refill your hand and keep the gas flowing in your deck. Then we have another mechanic. This set is full of them. It's called Cloak. Now, this is one of the few cards I found that actually had the reminder text on how you actually cloak a card. So this is Expose the Culprit. For 1 and a red, you get to do one or both. Instant speed, turn target face down creature face up. So if they have somebody that has a disguised creature or a morph creature, you can flip it face up. Or you can exile any number of face up creatures you control with disguise in a face down pile, shuffle the pile, and then cloak them. To cloak a card, you put them onto the battlefield face down as 2/2s with ward 2. So it basically reactivates their disguise ability. So if you have a bunch of disguised creatures on the battlefield, say 3 of them, and you exile all of them face down, shuffle them, and then cloak them down on the board face down, that works. There's also another card I saw where you can cloak the top card of your deck onto the battlefield face down. So it's kind of like a variation on Manifest in that way. We also have Investigate returning to the fold. Now, this is kind of obvious because Investigate and clues, it's a murder mystery. So, hey, it goes without saying. And this is probably one of the better cards I've seen so far from the set that involves it. It's Homicide Investigator. For 2 mana, get a 2/2 human detective. Whenever 1 or more non-token creatures you control die, you investigate. It triggers only once each turn. This is kind of in the vein of like the Grim Haruspex. When a non-token creature dies, you get to draw a card. Well, in this case, it's 1 mana cheaper to get it onto the battlefield, but you only get a clue token out of it, which may be better in some cases because you might be wanting that artifact synergies or have like kind of sacrifice fodder or whatever. but it only triggers once each turn. But you can make it do it on each of your opponent's turns. So in a multiplayer game, you can get multiple triggers on a turn cycle out of this particular card. Then we have our first reprint that's coming in out of the last Ravna cassette, Assassin's Trophy. 2 mana, destroy target permanent and opponent controls. Controller searches a library for a basic land card, puts it on the battlefield, then shuffle. Now, this was a pretty decent card the last time it was in Standard. You kind of have to balance that out, though, with the fact that you're going to accelerate them by a mana, and in some decks, that may be too big of a deterrence to actually run this card. So it's kind of a buyer beware situation. You may want to use this to get rid of something to save your butt right then and there, but you might be creating a bigger problem for yourself down the line. Then we have Bane FX, one of the 4/4s for 4. That's kind of the standard going rate for that size of creature in green. And then it has Death Touch and Haste, but it also has an award ability of Collect Evidence 4, which means they have to be able to exile 4 converted mana cost out of their graveyard in order to actually target this silly thing. So this is kind of interesting. It makes it so if you can control your opponent's graveyard in some way, like a Relic of Progenitus, nuke their graveyard or whatever, they can't target this thing. It's just like, if you keep eating cards out of their graveyard, they'll never be able to exile enough stuff to hit this thing with a removal spell. They'd have to rely on a board wipe exclusively to get rid of it. And a death touching 4/4 is a pretty good threat to deal with. And then if they want to block it to get rid of it, they're going to have to probably put one of their better creatures in front of it to get it off the board. Another new mechanic that I forgot to mention earlier in the video is these solved cases. Now, rather than having sagas like we've had for a long time now, we have Enchantment Case. So it's a new subtype of enchantment that we have in the game. And this is the Case of the Filched Falcon. You pay a blue, enters the battlefield, you get to investigate. Then to solve the case, you have to have 3 or more artifacts, and at the beginning of your end step, the solving triggers. If it's unsolved, it'll solve itself, and if you don't meet the requirements, it just sits there until your next end step to check that solve. If it's been solved after that end step ends, you can pay 2 and a blue, sacrifice the case, and put 4 +1/+1 counters on a non-creature artifact that you can, and it's any target, even your opponent's. And it becomes a 0/0 bird with flying in addition to its other types. So you could turn a treasure into a bird or whatever if you've solved the case. So if you have, some treasures, some clues or whatever laying around, it's probably pretty easy to get this thing solved and then go ahead and turn something into a 4/4 threat for your side of the board. Then we have the Case of the Pilfered Proof for 1 and a white. Whenever a detective enters the battlefield under your control, and whenever a detective you control is turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So you could play, detectives matter type things, and you can, play the new disguise detectives that get flipped up, and they all get counters on them. To solve, you have to control 3 or more detectives. So again, detectives matter. And then if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus a clue are created instead. So this is very much in the vein of like Peregrine took from the Lord of the Rings, where whenever a token was made, you also got food tokens to go with it. Well, this one, you get clue tokens. Here we have one of my favorite cards that I've seen thus far out of this set. This is Crime Novelist. It's a 2 and a red 1/3 Goblin Bard. We don't get bards very often. That says, whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a counter on Crime Novelist and add a red to your mana pool. So sacrifice a treasure, you get an additional red mana, and this gets 1 bigger. And it just keeps stacking up. Blood tokens, food tokens, clue tokens, all map tokens, all those tokens that you can sacrifice with just a little bit of cost. This thing will get bigger and add more mana to your mana pool. And eventually you can actually start chaining that red mana into sacrificing more things like the clue tokens and all that. It kind of has like a little bit of a snowball effect attached to it. And then you get a big goblin bard to go with it. Then we have a modal removal spell in Deadly Complication for 1, a black and red sorcery. Choose 1 or both, destroy target creature, or put a +1/+1 counter on a suspected creature you control, and you can have it lose its suspected status. So instead of having the menace and can't block, say you need it to be able to block, well, you can shut off that suspected status and make it a little bit bigger so then it can block, or you can get rid of an attacker that's going to be coming after you anyways. The only downside I see to this, that is a sorcery speed interaction rather than an instant speed interaction. But with those kind of options available to us, it's going to see quite a bit of play in limited. I know that much. And depending on how much suspected is like involved in your deck, you might be able to work this in like Commander and Standard as well. But outside of that, I don't see this getting a lot of play because suspected is going to be very limited to what's going on in this set. And maybe I should have done this card first, considering it shows that she's dead. But this is Teysa, Opulent Oligarch, one of our first legends that have been revealed in the new batch here. For 1, a white and a black, 2/3 human advisor with death touch. At the beginning of your end step, investigate for each opponent who lost life this turn. And whenever a clue you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create a 1/1 white and black spirit token creature with flying. But unfortunately, it only triggers once per turn. So, of course, they had to put a limiting factor on there so you couldn't just, dump all the stuff into like a Krark Clan Ironworks and make an army of 1/1s all of a sudden. But at the same time, this is kind of neat because if you have like a drain effect like a Zulaport Cutthroat or something like that, and it hits all of your opponents in one go, then you can create, 3 tokens in a game of multiplayer with this. It might be decent on one-on-one, but I think this is actually geared much more towards Commander and those kind of things, because of the fact that you can get multiple tokens off of it per turn when it's your turn. I could see this also being really good, especially since we're in white. You're going to have all the token doublers and token triplers that are available to us now. So you're going to get multiple clues off of this when the investigate part happens, and then you'll actually get to double dip back into that again and get a bunch of tokens every time that actually comes out into a spirit. So I don't know. I could see the C in play. I'm going to try to make it work, but one-on-one, I don't think it's going to be as good as it is in multiplayer. Then we have the initial suspect in the murder of Zagana, who died earlier in the story. It's Etrata, Deadly Fugitive, 1 a black and a blue. You get a Vampire Assassin, 1/4 with Death Touch. Face down creatures you control have pay 2, a blue and a black. Turn this creature face up. If you can't, exile it and then cast the card without paying its mana cost. I'm not sure. There might be something that keeps disguised creatures from being turned face up, or just face down creatures from being turned face up. I haven't seen it yet, but there's got to be a reason why that clause is attached there. And then whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, cloak the top card of that player's library. So if an assassin hits them, you get to take that top card and it goes onto the battlefield with as a 2/2 face down. So that's kind of interesting. And it could be also here that you get to turn it's a target creature. And now I kind of understand why it has the clause on it if you can't exile it. Because what it is you're hitting them, you get the 2/2 off the top of their deck. They don't get the creature. So it creates a 2/2 face down. And if it's not a creature, it could be an instant or a sorcery or a land or whatever, you could actually hit it. It flips. Oh, it's not a creature, so you technically can't flip it face up. So you get to exile it and then cast that instant sorcery, enchantment, whatever. Now, if it's a land, you can't cast it. It's not a land. So lands cannot be turned face up. You will lose them. So I would be careful not to do this with a land because you can't cast a land. And then here we have Ione, Center of the Web, who's kind of the current Golgari leader right now. For 4, a black and a green, elf detective, 5/4 with menace. Pretty good sized body with menace. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can collect evidence 4, which means you can exile up to 4 converted mana costs from your graveyard. If you do, create 2 2/1 black and green spider tokens with menace and reach. Kind of sounds like the spiders that you get off of Lolth. And then you can sacrifice 4 tokens to surveil 2, then draw 2 cards, gain 2 life. I just did the video yesterday for the Myco Tyrant. This card would be in that deck, bar none. I'd have that in there easily to sacrifice tokens, surveil, and create more stuff on my turn and draw cards and gain life. Yeah, this would be a slam dunk in that deck. I could see this getting some play in some graveyard type decks. And then here we have a little bone of contention with some players. This is Judith, Carnage Connoisseur. For 3, a black and a red, you get a 3/4 human shaman. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, choose one. That spell gains death touch and lifelink. Hey, burn spells gaining things for us. Or create a 2/2 red imp creature token with when the creature dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. Now the bone of contention here is it is tied to instants and sorceries, which is more of an is it thing, So some people are kind of burned on that. They don't like that the Rakdos lead here is actually getting a ability that kind of ties more towards the is it guild instead. And then we have our Kaaya Planeswalker. It's the only Planeswalker that's showing up in the set unless they are breaking the rules of the new 1 Planeswalker per set rules. For 2, a black and a white, you would get Kaaya Spirit's Justice. Starts at 3 loyalty. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile, you may choose a creature card from among them until end of turn target token you control becomes a copy of it except it has flying. And it has a +2 of surveil 2, exile a card from a graveyard, +1, create a 1/1 black and white spirit token with flying, or -2, exile target creature you control for each other player, exile up to 1 creature they control. So what's cool here is she kind of feeds herself. She has a +1 of creating a spirit token for us to have a token to actually use her static ability with. So then when you do the surveil 2 and exile card from your graveyard or a graveyard, so like if you do it from your graveyard, you're going to go ahead and exile something out, and then you can turn one of those spirits into one of the creatures you've exiled out. Or you can do the -2, exile one of your like tokens, and then exile their stuff too. And then when you exile that creature or whatever, you could turn one of your tokens into one of the things you've exiled. It's convoluted, sounds very complicated, but it's actually kind of interesting. Completely different than what Kaaya usually does, where usually she's like, -3 exile target creature. That's all it is. That's what you get out of it. In this case, it's like you can exile one of your creatures to exile a bunch of other stuff for other players, but you also get to kind of manipulate tokens, which white has kind of been pushed more and more into that token realm as of late. So this kind of interacts really well with that. Plus, we get the surveil mechanic to put stuff into our graveyard to be able to exile with her and kind of churn that ability along. So it's kind of a self-contained engine in and of itself if you can keep her online. And no trip back to Ravnica can't include Krenko. He's been there every time we've gone back. Well, here he is once again. This is Krenko, Baron of Tin Street for 2 and a red, legendary creature, goblin with haste, 3/3. So he's got a good sized body, good rate for a red 3/3. Tap, sack an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on each goblin you control. Wow. That's pretty strong in a goblin deck. You just, sacrifice any kind of treasures, clues, anything that's laying around, boom, you're going to get a +1/+1 counter on all your stuff. And then whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you can pay an additional red. And if you do, you create a 1/1 goblin token with haste until end of turn. So you get a 1/1 goblin that has that haste ability. And then you are able to, tap him, sacrifice, and then put a counter on all your stuff. And the nice part is the way this is templated, you tap and sack, you put the counter on the stack, and then this other trigger goes on the stack on top of it. So that 1/1 comes out before the resolution of the +1/+1 counter, so that it also gains that +1/+1 counter. And then goblins are really easy to make a bunch of tokens and random stuff with. So this is a good way to turbocharge a goblin deck without relying on your stock standard all goblins get +1/+1 Lord cards. Then here we have the latest iteration of Kellen. It's the Inquisitive Prodigy for 2, a green and a blue. You get a 3/4 human fairy detective, so he's gaining a detective subtype that says tail the suspect as his adventure for a green and a blue. You get to investigate and play an additional land this turn. So it's a sorcery speed variation on growth spiral. Then instead of drawing you the card, you get to create a clue, which then you get to draw off of later. And then he has flying and vigilance when he's a creature, and whenever it attacks, destroy up to 1 target artifact, and if you control that permanent, draw a card. So as you're creating clues and foods and treasures and all that stuff, and you attack with him, you get to blow them up as you go and get the card anyways without paying the extra mana to actually pop the clue and draw the card. So this is kind of an interesting, it feeds itself for at least 1 card, and then you get to just keep, swinging along. And it's got a decent sized body, and it doesn't tap to attack, so it can go on the offense and sit back on defense with that 4 toughness on the backside. So here's our expensive Is It Rare in the set, kind of in line with like Ovika and the Locust God and that kind of stuff. This is Kylock's Visionary Inventor for 7 mana. You get a Viashino Artificer. It's a 4/4 with Menace, Ward 2, and Haste, so it can swing the turn it comes into play. So at least it actually, you don't have to worry about it getting blown up unless they have an instant speed removal spell on the spot. And then whenever it attacks, sacrifice any number of other creatures, then exile the top X cards of your library where X is their total power. And then you can cast any number of instants of sorceries from among the exiled cards without paying the mana cost. This is really, really strong. Like, as long as you're able to generate, 5, 6, 7 little like 1/1s or whatever on the board, be they goblins, using the aforementioned Ovika or the Locust God, and you swing with him, and then you're able to sacrifice all that stuff, and you get to free cast, 6 or 7 cards off the top of your deck. That's pretty dang strong. This is why this is a 7 drop, because this can just end a game out of nowhere. Bear in mind, though, do not use X spells in a deck that you want to focus this guy around, because X is 0 when you free cast like that, and that's not a good plan. And then here we have another suspect that is in this story. It's Massacre Girl, Known Killer. For 2 black, you get a 4/4 human assassin with menace. Creatures you control have wither. We haven't seen a wither as a mechanic in a very long time. It means that when they deal damage, it puts -1/-1 counters on them. This is going in my Hapatra deck. Slam dunk, no questions asked. And it says, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, draw a card. I thought it was going to say 1 or less. No, it's less than 1. So basically, if you kill a creature with a -1/-1 counter, the wither ability that this includes, or use something like the Meat Hook Massacre or Languish that reduces them to 0 when they die, you get cards off of all those things going to the graveyard. This is a really damn good card, and I like this. Then here we have a new variation of Melek, the Reforged Researcher. For 5 mana, you get a star Weird Detective. Its power and toughness are equal to double the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So if you're playing a Spell Slinger deck, he will get 2 bigger for everything that hits the graveyard. And the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs 3 less to cast. That's a big discount. I actually have a Melek Izzet Paragon Commander deck that I've played, which was all about discounting spells and making them cheaper and able to do things for us. That is actually this is going in that deck when I put it back together. I'm actually thinking about putting it back together, because you want to discount some of the big stuff like Time Stretch. You want to be able to discount big X spells and just dumb stuff, and knocking 3 mana off of some of this stuff is big game in that kind of deck. Then we have a new Selesnya legend in Tolsimir, Midnight's Light. For 5 mana, you get a 3/2 Elf Scout with lifelink. And when it enters the battlefield, you create Wojack Fen Stalker, a legendary 5/5 green-white wolf creature token with trample. So for 5 mana, you get a 3/2 and a 5/5. That's pretty good rate. And then whenever a wolf you control attacks, if Tolsimir attacked as well, target creature an opponent controls blocks that wolf this combat if able. So you can force block something. So if your opponent doesn't want to, block, or they want to protect one of their creatures, you have a way to make the thing that could kill Tolsimir block Wojack, and then they have to block like a little 1/1 or whatever on Tolsimir. So it's a way to protect him in combat, or just force them to, kill the creature they don't want dead in a combat step, in a color combination that, you have exile stuff, but green itself doesn't have a ton of actual removal. So this is kind of cool. I kind of like the card. It could be a wolf, like a Wolves Matter type deck coming out. I'm not sure. And the reason I say that is because we now have a new Wojack card of its own, the Jaws of the Conclave. It's Naya colors. For 2, a red, a green, and a white. You get a 5/5 wolf with Vigilance, Trample, and Ward 3. So you go from the 5/5 trampling token to the Vigilance Ward 3 being added to that trample 5/5. And whenever it attacks, put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is the number of elves you control, and then draw a card for each wolf you control. So you could actually build up like a dual wolf elf deck and get just mad numbers of counters on stuff and draw cards. Like, this card is kind of nuts. I'm going to be brewing around this thing real soon. I think I'm going to try to get a video up on this before the set releases, because that's a pretty good card, and that could make for a good deck out of this. Then comes a card that actually isn't legal in the pre-release. This is going to be one of the cards that's included in the pre-release kits, but it is standard legal. And this is Tomic Wielder of Law. For a 1, a white, and a black, you get a 2/4 human advisor with affinity for planeswalkers. So it costs 1 less to cast for each planeswalker you control. And that includes the tax that you get on these. So if Tomic is your commander and it dies a couple of times, if you have multiple planeswalkers out, the tax will get reduced by a colorless for the affinity planeswalker part of this card. It also has flying and vigilance, and whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you and or planeswalkers you control, they lose 3 life and you draw a card. So if they have multiple attackers trying to tear down your planeswalkers or just go after you, they're going to pay by losing some life and giving you a card in order to do so. So that can kind of mess with the combat calculus. If they don't want us getting cards, or they can't afford to pay that life, they're not going to be able to attack with maybe one thing at a time. Then we have the Selesnya Leader, Trostani, 3 Whispers, and we have a hybrid mana on this one for green, a white, and a hybrid green white. You get a 4/4 Dryad. 1 and a green, target creature gains Death Touch until end of turn. Hybrid green white, target creature gains Vigilance until end of turn. And 2 and a white, target creature gains Double Strike until end of turn. You don't often see the ability to grant Double Strike attached to a creature, so that's kind of interesting. And then you can also use it with the Death Touch part. So for 5 mana, 3 and a green and a white, you can give something Death Touch and Double Strike to be able to tear a creature down before they can actually kill something in combat. So that's kind of cool. And then if you want that creature to hang back, you can give it Vigilance before combat. So this is kind of interesting. And it's a 4/4 for 3 is a good rate, but it's kind of hard to cast because of the color considerations. We also have War Leader's Call for 1, a red, and a white. It's an enchantment that gives all your creatures +1/+1. So it's your standard Anthem effect. But then it also has a rider, and this is the red part. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, War Leader's Call deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it actually straps together the impact tremors along with this. So this gives us in red white another impact tremors effect, which I absolutely love. And then it also bolsters our power of our creatures as they come into play. So this is my bread and butter. I love this kind of card, and I can't wait to give it a try in some kind of Boros aggro style deck. Then we have what I think is probably the most impressive Investigate card I've seen thus far out of the spoilers. And this is Wojack Investigator. For 2 and a white, you get a Angel Detective. It's a 2/4 flying with Vigilance. At the beginning of your upkeep, investigate for each opponent who has more cards in hand than you. Well, we're in white. As long as you're not playing like white-blue, you should be burning through cards decently enough where you're able to investigate multiple times in Commander and just be able to create several investigated tokens. So I'm pretty sure that this will see quite a bit of play, especially if you're in some kind of Artifacts Matter type deck with white in it, or you just want to have those clues as ways to sacrifice. And then again, you're also in white, which that's our token doubling and tripling stuff that's going on now. So you're going to get multiple clue tokens out of this. This could be one of those cards that snowballs out of control. And most people are going to look at it and go, it's a 2/4 for 3. Who cares? But it's that trigger that could really wreck a game, especially if your opponents are drawing cards and you're kind of keeping your hand low as you go along. The last couple cards are some translation cards. I have to pull up the translation for these ones. This one is Bloodline Ripper, according to the translation. For 3 and triple black, you get a 6/5 vampire assassin with flying and ward of sacrifice a creature, which is not that impressive. Ward sacrifice creature is very easy to get around. I'm not a particular fan of that ward ability. But whenever a creature dies, target player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this is a souped up variation of Blood Artist, which allows us to drain for 2 instead of 1. And it has a good sized body attached to it as well. So this will see quite a bit of play, and it's a mythic. So I don't anticipate this card being very cheap to get your hands on. I would guess that this is probably going to be at least a $10 card coming out the gate. So I would keep an eye on this one if you want to get this for your black decks. And the second translated card, and I lied, there's actually another few cards I'm going to show you in a blown up view. But this one is the Case of the Gorgons Kiss. For a black mana, when it enters the battlefield, it's an enchantment clue that says that you destroy target creature that was dealt damage this turn. And to solve the case, 3 creatures have to go to the graveyard before the end of your turn. And then if it's solved, it transforms into a 4/4 Gorgon creature with Death Touch. So that's kind of a fun little way. And no, that is not Vraska. There are other Gorgons on the plane of Ravnica. This just happens to be one of them. And I kind of like this. This is kind of fun. We get those black destroy creatures that have been dealt damage things all the time. This kind of just ups the ante a little bit, because if you're able to kill multiple creatures or kill something with this and then sacrifice a couple other little doinks or whatever, you get to flip this over into a 4/4 essentially, and you get to have some fun with that. So I kind of like that. It's kind of fun. And I want to give that one a try. So for the last stuff, I took my face off screen so they'd all fit. These are the new dual lands coming in. We don't get shock lands this time on Ravnica, but we get these, what I would call the surveil lands, because all they have on them is enters tapped, and then when they enter, they surveil 1. But that is a pretty strong ability. I kind of wish they would have put different abilities on them, kind of coded to each guild. Like the black and blue one obviously would have been surveil, but they could have done something with some of the other stuff. But, you know, this is probably just their way of making it easy. We have Meticulous Archive, the white-blue land for the Azorius. We have the Demir Guild getting Undercity Sewers, Raucous Theater for the Rakdos, Commercial District for the Gruul, Scrolling down a little bit further, we have Shadowy Backstreet for the Orzhov, Thundering Falls for the Izzet, Underground Mortuary for the Golgari, and Elegant Parlor for the Boros. And then we also have a few other lands that they put in there that weren't there just a little bit ago, so I'll go ahead and take a quick look and talk about them. We got Branch of Vitu-Ghazi. It's got Disguise 3, so if you don't need the land late game, you can just play it as a 2/2 face down and kind of hide what it is from your opponents, which is kind of nice, and attack with it as necessary. And then when it's turn face up, add 2 mana of any one color. Until end of turn, you don't lose the mana as the phases and steps, and which is kind of cool, because then you could actually run it into combat or block with it and then flip it over so it won't die in combat. And then you get that mana to sit on and use later in the turn. They also have Scene of the Crime, which is an artifact land clue. So it's our first clue type land, but it's an artifact land, which is nice to use with like affinity type decks and anything that cares about your artifacts. As it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped, taps for colorless, and you can tap it and an untapped creature you control to add mana of any one color. Or you can sack it and draw a card just like a regular clue token. And then we have an interesting card. Now, we've seen things like this before with Public Thoroughfare. It's a land that when it enters the battlefield, it's tapped. And when it enters, you have to sack it unless you tap an untapped artifact or a land you control and it taps for any color. Now, we've seen things like Rupture Spire and stuff like that where you have to pay a mana when it comes in or you sacrifice it. But what's nice here is you don't have to pay the mana unless you're tapping the land. You can tap an untapped artifact. Well, what's a good untapped artifact? Equipment cards. They make for great things to tap when you want to tap an artifact for something, or you go ahead and you use something like a static artifact that doesn't really have an activated ability on it, like Throne of the God Pharaoh or something like that. You just slam that down and be like, okay, I'm just going to tap it and just keep going through there. I kind of dig this card. I think this actually could be usable in Commander because you're going to have stuff laying around that you may not want to burn right away, and you don't have to have your lands tied up when you have those artifacts laying around and just ready to tap and add this to the board. So that's what I have for you guys today. It's a little bit of catch up from yesterday. I didn't have time to go into the previews yesterday before I had to go to work. So today I'm catching up, doing a little bit of day 2 stuff as well, and I will keep an eye out on anything new that comes out later today, and I will put that in tomorrow's video. Until then, if you like what I'm doing, please feel free to subscribe so you're notified when I'm putting out content, and you will get to see that when that comes up. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.